There's a part of American history that rarely makes it into textbooks or mainstream conversation. A story that challenges everything we think we know about slavery, resistance, and the fight for freedom. This is the story of the Black Seminoles, a group whose legacy has been pushed to the margins, if not outright erased. But why? Why would a history so rich, so layered, and so defiant be hidden from public view? The Black Seminoles were more than just survivors of a brutal system. They were fighters, bridge builders, and freedom seekers who made choices that shook the foundations of the power structures around them. Their presence disrupted the narrative of helplessness, and their alliances threatened the status quo in ways that made many uncomfortable then and now. Come along with us as we explore the remarkable history of the Black Seminoles and discover why such a strong community with a powerful legacy was hidden from public view. Don't forget to give this video a like to show your support, and let's begin this journey of courage, resistance, and resilience. The story of the Black Seminoles begins in the early 18th century in Spanish Florida, where two oppressed groups, African-descended escapees and Seminole Indians, formed an alliance that led to the creation of a new Afro-Indigenous community. The term Black Seminoles refers to runaway slaves from the American South who found refuge among the Seminole tribe, intermarried, and built a unique blended culture. The Seminole people were relatively new in Florida, having formed in the 18th century from a mix of Muskogee or Creek, Hitchiti, Yamasee, and other tribes. The word Seminole comes from the Creek word Seminole, meaning wild or untamed, and trust me, they lived up to that name. While European colonial powers wanted to control their land, the Seminoles were used to having their independence, so they fought like hell to keep it. Their lives, like those of the African escapees, were marked by the pressures of colonial violence. As for the African-descended escapees, many of them had been enslaved on brutal rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. Their lives were dominated by grueling labor under horrific conditions. These were the kinds of jobs no human should be forced into, but the enslaved people were exploited to make wealthy plantation owners even richer. Faced with this cruelty, many escaped at the first opportunity they had. For many, the Seminoles became their lifeline to freedom. The plantations were horrific, but the Seminoles gave them a shot at living free in Florida, away from the oppressive colonial authorities. It was there that they could finally breathe and live their own lives outside of the shackles of slavery. In Florida, the Black Seminoles and Seminoles created a symbiotic relationship. The Black Seminoles, who formed their own villages, adopted Seminole agricultural practices and helped the Seminoles with farming, especially rice cultivation. The Seminoles, in return, gave them protection from slave catchers and other colonial threats. The land was harsh, but it was the land they shared, and they made it work. Over time, these two groups shared their knowledge of farming, food preservation, shelter construction, and medicine. They even celebrated together through dance and music, blending African rhythms with native styles. While language and religion differed, these differences didn't prevent the development of a close bond. Intermarriage became common, and the Afro-Indigenous culture that emerged was unlike anything seen before. The early years of the Black Seminole community were significantly influenced by the policies of the colonial powers. Notably, Spanish Florida provided a sanctuary for escaped slaves long before Florida became part of the United States. As early as 1693, the Spanish crown issued decrees offering freedom to any enslaved person who managed to flee from the British colonies and reach Florida, with the condition that they convert to Catholicism. It was a strategic move by Spain to undermine British power and bolster Spain's own defensive frontier. One famous early sanctuary was Fort Mose, or Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, near St. Augustine, established in 1738 as a town for freed blacks. This was the first free black community in what is now the United States. Dozens of these freedom seekers later joined Seminole communities in the interior. By the mid-1700s, maroon settlements of self-liberated blacks dotted Spanish Florida, from the Apalachicola River region to the Atlantic coast. These Maroons often cooperated with Spanish authorities and also lived alongside various native groups. Over time, As the Seminole tribe itself coalesced from Creek, Hitchiti, Yamasee, and other native peoples who moved into Florida, the nearby Black Maroon villages and Seminole towns grew intertwined. While some Black Seminoles were enslaved in a nominal sense by Seminole leaders, slavery in the Seminole context differed greatly from plantation slavery. European observers noted that Seminole slaves lived in their own settlements, farmed independently, bore arms, and paid only a yearly tribute of crops to Seminole chiefs. They were more like vassals or allies than chattel property. In fact, the Seminoles relied on these Black communities for agricultural produce and as cultural intermediaries with colonial powers, since the Black Seminoles, many speaking Creole English, could act as translators and negotiators in dealings with English speakers. Through decades of living side by side, a blended culture emerged. Together in Florida, they even developed a new Afro-Seminole Creole language, mixing Gullah, English, Spanish, and Creek influences, which survived for generations and was only identified by linguists in 1978. By the turn of the 19th century, the Black Seminoles had become a distinct community, an Afro-Indigenous Maroon nation, living largely free in Spanish Florida. They had carved out autonomy in a frontier beyond the full control of any European empire. But of course, this freedom didn't sit well with the growing power of the United States. The very existence of the Black Seminoles was a threat to the slave-holding South. As the U.S. expanded into Florida, the Black Seminoles' resolve to remain free would soon lead them into conflict with the U.S. military. When the United States began invading Florida in the early 19th century, the Black Seminoles were at the forefront of resisting U.S. domination. Over the course of 3 Seminole Wars, spanning from 1817 to 1818, 1835 to 1842, and 1855 to 1858, the Black Seminoles and their native Seminole allies mounted some of the most sustained defenses against U.S. military forces and slave catchers. In fact, many contemporaries viewed these wars not just as battles between the U.S. and Native Americans, but as uprisings against slavery. U.S. General Thomas Sidney Jessup, who fought in the Second Seminole War, bluntly admitted in 1837, "This is a Negro war, not an Indian war." Indeed, the Black Seminoles were not only fighting for the freedom of their community, but also inspiring enslaved African Americans across the South to rise up. The First Seminole War, from 1817 to 1818, was largely triggered by the fear American settlers had of the Black Seminole communities just across the border in Spanish Florida. These communities were a direct threat to slave owners because they served as sanctuaries for runaway slaves and proved that African people didn't need to live under white control. In 1816, General Andrew Jackson ordered an attack on a Black Seminole stronghold known as Negro Fort at Prospect Bluff on the Apalachicola River. Hundreds of Black men, women, and children had gathered in this fort, which was originally built by the British. When an American cannon shot hit the fort's powder magazine, the explosion killed over 300 of its defenders in an instant. The few survivors were violently returned to slavery. This massacre made it clear that the U.S. was willing to use overwhelming force to crush Black freedom enclaves. In 1818, during Jackson's invasion of Florida, U.S. troops and allied Creek mercenaries continued to destroy Black Seminole and Seminole villages, burning crops and capturing people. In response, many Black Seminoles retreated further south into Florida's marshes and Everglades, while others escaped by sea to the Bahamas. About 300 of them fled in 1821, making their way to Andros Island to avoid being caught under U.S. rule. When Spain ceded Florida to the United States in 1821, the stage was set for an even larger conflict, as the Seminoles, both Black and Native, refused to accept U.S. demands to relocate. The Second Seminole War, from 1835 to 1842, would become the largest and deadliest Indian war in U.S. history, in large part because of the Black Seminoles' involvement. Under pressure from American officials and slave owners, a removal treaty was forced upon some Seminole leaders, demanding that the Seminoles deport their Black members, effectively handing them over to slavery. The Seminoles rejected this demand, and tensions reached a boiling point in late 1835. Black Seminole leaders like John Caesar, Abraham, and John Horse also known as Juan Caballo, traveled by night from one Florida plantation to another, secretly recruiting enslaved blacks to join the coming rebellion. They promised the slaves liberty if they rose up. Frank Berry, a former slave from Jacksonville, later confirmed that the Seminoles incited many uprisings and wholesale escapes among the slaves. The fear of a combined slave and native rebellion spread like wildfire among plantation owners, who knew how devastating such an alliance could be. On December 28, 1835, Seminole warriors ambushed U.S. troops in the infamous Dade Battle, killing over 100 soldiers and igniting the war. As the conflict widened, Black Seminoles took on important positions as warriors, guides, and translators in the Seminole forces. John Horse, in particular, emerged as a charismatic leader, and Abraham, a Black Seminole diplomat, worked as an advisor to Chief McCanopy. Together, Native and Black Seminoles led a guerrilla war that frustrated the U.S. military's every move, vanishing into the wilderness after every strike. In one of the war's major engagements, the Battle of Lake Okeechobee, on Christmas Day, 1837, a force of about 300 to 400 Seminole and Black Seminole fighters, under Chiefs Billy Bowlegs and Alligator, inflicted a stinging defeat on Colonel Zachary Taylor's much larger U.S. force. Taylor lost 1/4 of his men as the Seminole sharpshooters cut down wave after wave of American soldiers. The Seminoles withdrew in good order, undefeated. Yet Taylor claimed it as a U.S. victory and was lauded as an Indian killer hero, a prime example of how Black Seminole successes were downplayed or distorted in the historical record. In reality, Lake Okeechobee was one of the U.S. Army's worst losses in any Indian war. Despite their ferocity and tactical savvy, the Seminoles, who were greatly outnumbered and outsupplied, gradually saw their numbers dwindle. By 1842, the U.S. had deported about 4,000 Seminoles, both Black and Native, to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. But the war had come at a massive cost. 1,500 U.S. soldiers died, and $40 million was spent, forcing the U.S. to come to terms with how ferocious the Seminole resistance had been. Many Seminoles never formally surrendered, which is a point of pride for Seminole descendants to this day. Some managed to escape U.S. removal entirely, retreating deeper into the Everglades, where their descendants remain as the Seminole tribe of Florida. But not all Black Seminoles were as fortunate. Some, who had either fled to the Bahamas or joined the Seminole holdouts in the Everglades, would carry the flame of resistance into the Third Seminole War from 1855 to 1858, though on a smaller scale. Even as formal warfare died down in Florida, the Black Seminoles' fight for freedom took new shape in exile. In the Indian Territory, the transplanted Black Seminoles faced renewed threats. The U.S. had placed the Seminole Nation under the authority of the Creek Nation, where Black people were vulnerable to being enslaved by Creek slaveholders. True to their legacy of resisting bondage, the Black Seminoles did not submit. In 1849, led by John Horse and the Seminole chief Wildcat, a large group of Black Seminoles and Seminoles fled the territory altogether, embarking on a perilous trek to Mexico. Mexico had abolished slavery and welcomed these freedom seekers, whom they called Los Mascogos, on the condition that they helped defend Mexico's northern frontier from Comanche raids. Thus, in the 1850s, a sizable Black Seminole community reestablished itself in El Nacimiento, Coahuila, Mexico, living freely under Mexican protection and continuing to raid across the border against slave-catching posses from Texas. By the post-Civil War era, the Black Seminoles found themselves back in the United States in a surprising twist of fate. Beginning in the 1870s, some Black Seminoles who had fled to Mexico were enlisted by the U.S. Army as the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. Stationed at Fort Clark in Texas, these scouts, including heroes like Sergeant John Ward and Sergeant Pompey Factor, distinguished themselves by protecting American settlements from Apache and Comanche attacks in exchange for promises of land. Known for their incredible skills as trackers and fighters, 4 Black Seminole scouts earned the Medal of Honor for their bravery. However, despite their heroic service, they still faced discrimination. After the Indian Wars wound down, the U.S. Army disbanded the scouts in 1914, and the land grants they were promised were never delivered. The Black Seminoles and their families, who had settled near Fort Clark, were ultimately forced off the military reservation. Many of them went on to found the town of Brackettville, Texas, where many of their descendants continue to live today. The Black Seminoles' resistance was nothing short of extraordinary. They challenged U.S. expansion and slavery, sparking uprisings and forming maroon communities that lived beyond the reach of American authorities. Yet, despite their significant contributions, their efforts were often minimized or completely erased from history. Mainstream narratives about the Seminole Wars rarely acknowledge the Black Seminoles, whose involvement made the resistance so formidable. Their fight against enslavement, injustice, and forced removal is a vital part of history that has too often been overlooked. For much of American history, the story of the Black Seminoles was largely missing from textbooks, ignored in classrooms, and excluded from the national narrative. This wasn't a simple oversight. It was a deliberate choice, shaped by the racial attitudes and political priorities that dominated the times. The consequence is that the Black Seminoles became, as one historian put it, a powerful and often overlooked chapter of American history. Their courageous fight for freedom was largely forgotten by the general public, even as less significant events were celebrated. One clear indicator of this marginalization is the near-total lack of mention of Black Seminoles in standard U.S. history curricula throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. School textbooks scarcely acknowledge that people of African descent fought in the Seminole Wars. When the Seminole Wars were mentioned, Black participants were usually glossed over. The focus would be on famous Native figures like Chief Osceola or on U.S. officers, without recognizing Black Seminole leaders. As a result, generations of students formed the impression that the Seminole Wars were purely an Indian issue, never learning that it was the largest sustained slave rebellion in U.S. history. Historian William Loren Katz expressed his frustration, noting that this amazing story has yet to capture public attention and is absent from most school textbooks, social studies courses, Hollywood movies, and TV. In other words, the Black Seminoles story was systematically excluded from the mainstream narratives that shape how we understand history. Instead of learning about figures like Abraham, John Horse, or Wildcat, students were taught about Andrew Jackson's exploits in Florida, or the idea of manifest destiny pushing westward, framing the Seminole resistance as just a minor obstacle in America's march toward expansion. Even when modern textbooks do mention the Seminole Wars, they often treat them as minor footnotes in the broader narrative of manifest destiny, rather than recognizing them for what they truly were, a multi-ethnic armed struggle against oppression. But why would mainstream historians and educators omit such a dramatic story of freedom fighters? Part of the reason is that the Black Seminoles did not fit well into the simplified racial narratives that dominated U.S. historiography. Traditional narratives separated American history into discrete categories: Indian wars on one hand, slave revolts on another. The Black Seminoles blurred those lines with their very identity. They were both African American and Native ally, both victims of slavery and partners in indigenous resistance. They didn't fit into the binary black versus white portrayal of slavery, nor did they align with the traditional telling of the Indian Wars as a U.S. versus Indians conflict. Because of this, their story was often seen as inconvenient and was conveniently left out of mainstream narratives. Acknowledging that a significant portion of the Seminole fighting force was Black would have meant acknowledging Black agency and military success in the antebellum era, a concept uncomfortable for many early historians, influenced by the racial biases of their time. The idea that Black people had built and sustained their own independent communities and even developed a new language and culture in defiance of white authority was downplayed because it contradicted the white supremacist assumptions that were prevalent in academic circles well into the 20th century. Another reason for the Black Seminoles' erasure was the geographical and cultural marginalization of their descendants after the wars. Those who stayed in the U.S. were a small group in Oklahoma, categorized simply as freedmen within the Seminole Nation, with little voice in larger society and facing discrimination that kept their history hidden. Meanwhile, those who had fled to places like Mexico or the Bahamas were effectively erased from U.S. discourse, completely removed from the national narrative. Without a politically powerful constituency to advocate for them, it was easy for writers and historians to ignore their story. Additionally, early scholarly work on Native Americans often overlooked Afro-Indigenous people. Anthropologists and historians focusing on the Seminoles in Florida or Oklahoma might have treated the Black Seminoles as a side note, if at all. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that dedicated research by people like Kenneth Wiggins Porter, for example, began to shine a light on Black Seminole history. But even then, such research took decades to filter into popular knowledge. Mainstream popular culture also contributed to erasure. Consider Hollywood. Dozens of films were made about frontier battles, Indian wars, and even the Seminole War, like the 1953 film Seminoles starring Rock Hudson, yet virtually none depicted Black Seminoles in any meaningful way. A movie-going or novel-reading American in the 1900s would likely never encounter a Black Seminole character, even in stories set in Florida. This cultural silence reinforced the historical amnesia. It is telling that as late as the 21st century, many people expressed surprise when they first learned about the Black Seminoles. Corina Torralba, a Black Seminole descendant from Nacimiento, who moved to San Antonio as a child, recalled, "I never learned it in school here in the U.S. I just thought, why is it that I never heard this history?" That sentiment is echoed by students and adults alike when confronted with the astonishing saga of the Black Seminoles. How could such an important story remain untold for so long? The intentional nature of the Black Seminoles' erasure is revealed in the writings of those who have worked to bring their story to light. Modern scholars and educators argue that there are those uncomfortable with the truth of America's racial past who continue to ensure that students don't learn it. Controversies over educational curricula show that certain painful or challenging aspects of history, such as violent repression of slave uprisings or Black Indian alliances, were often glossed over to present a more celebratory national narrative. The Seminole Wars were long portrayed as a noble campaign by Andrew Jackson and others to tame the wilderness, rather than what they also were, an effort to capture or kill Black freedom seekers. In Florida's state history, tourist brochures and heritage sites long celebrated the Seminole tribe's gallant resistance, which indeed was gallant, but usually without acknowledging the Black Seminoles who stood shoulder to shoulder with Osceola and other chiefs. Only recently have some historical sites begun to mention them. For instance, the Fort King National Historic Landmark in Ocala now admits that the history of the Black Seminoles is an often overlooked, yet incredibly important part of Florida's history, noting that their contributions to the state's past have been largely omitted. That such a statement needs to be made in the 2020s is evidence of how entrenched the omission was. Beyond outright omission, marginalization also occurred through mischaracterization. When Black Seminoles did appear in historical literature, they were sometimes depicted in diminishing ways. Earlier generations of historians, writing in the 1800s, frequently described the Black Seminoles as mere pawns of Spanish intrigue, or as instigators who stirred up the otherwise content Seminoles into war, narratives that either stripped Black Seminoles of independent heroism or cast them negatively. Such portrayals made it less likely for future historians to celebrate them. Additionally, the label Seminole slave was often applied to Black Seminoles, which misrepresented their true status and agency. This terminology could lead readers to assume these individuals were not freedom fighters, but simply enslaved people under Seminole masters, further minimizing recognition of their active resistance. The cumulative effect of these tendencies was that, by the mid-20th century, the Black Seminoles story was largely confined to specialist academic circles and the oral traditions of their own descendants. The general American public, even those interested in African American or Native American history, knew little of it. Where the story was remembered, it was often only partially told. It has taken persistent efforts by historians and community leaders to begin correcting this narrative, which we'll talk about soon. But it's clear that the erasure of the Black Seminoles from mainstream history was neither accidental nor benign. One big reason the story of the Black Seminoles stayed hidden for so long is that they didn't leave behind a lot of written records from their own perspective. Unlike some of the well-known figures in American history who kept diaries or wrote letters, The Black Seminoles didn't have a stash of documents for historians to dig through. Instead, their story was passed down through oral traditions, stories and memories told by their descendants in places like Oklahoma, Texas, Mexico, and the Bahamas. Back in the 19th century, many Black Seminoles couldn't read or write, though some spoke multiple languages. Their focus wasn't on writing down their history, but on survival. As fugitives or exiles, their primary goal was simply to stay alive, not to preserve a written record. So, most of what we know about their lives and their role in the Seminole Wars comes from the official records, which were mostly written by U.S. military officers, government agents, or occasionally native Seminole leaders. When Black Seminoles did show up in these records, they were usually treated as secondary characters, often described with bias or confusion. For example, Army officers mentioned Negroes among the enemy, but rarely recorded their personal names or motives, except in a few notable cases like John Horse or Abraham, who interacted with them in negotiations. The Black Seminole voice was largely missing from the written archive. As a result, later historians had to piece together the Black Seminoles' story by reading between the lines of white-authored documents, a task many did not undertake, especially in eras when Black contributions were undervalued. What the Black Seminoles did have was a strong oral culture. They preserved songs, stories, and even unique linguistic elements that carried the essence of their historical experience. In the relative isolation of their communities, whether the Black Seminole bands in Oklahoma or the Mascogo settlement in Nacimiento, Mexico, or Red Bays in Andros Island, Bahamas, elders became the keepers of memory. They passed down tales of how their ancestors fought in Florida, how they journeyed far for freedom, and how they related to the Seminole Indians and to African heritage. For instance, in the Bahamas, the Red Bays community preserved specific social memory to construct their identity and history, maintaining that they came from Florida as escapees pursued by Americans. They kept alive distinctive practices like basket weaving and grave rituals linking back to Seminole customs. Similarly, in Brackettville, Texas, the Black Seminole descendants held gatherings where elders recounted the story of the long walk from Oklahoma to Mexico and the exploits of their scout ancestors. These oral histories ensured that, at least within those families, the memory of being Black Seminole did not vanish completely. However, oral history has its limitations in reaching a broader audience. For a long time, the stories told on front porches in Brackettville or around campfires in Oklahoma stayed in those circles. Mainstream historians often overlooked oral testimonies, considering them less reliable than written documents. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that some scholars began actively seeking out Black Seminole oral histories. Pioneering researchers like Kenneth W. Porter in the 1940s to 50s traveled to meet Black Seminole elders and record their recollections. More recently, ethnographers like Shirley Butler Mock and anthropologist Rosalind Howard have centered oral interviews in their work. For example, Butler Mock's book, Dreaming with the Ancestors, interweaves archival research with extensive interviews of Black Seminole women, demonstrating how vital their oral narratives are to understanding the group's migration and survival. She highlights that Black Seminole women saved and passed down knowledge through storytelling and song, thus keeping history alive when written sources were scarce. The absence of formal documentation of the Black Seminoles' history is closely tied to their marginalized status in society. When Black Seminoles spoke, who was actually listening? In the 19th century, newspapers and historians in the U.S. paid little attention to the voices of Black Seminoles unless they had something sensational to say. One rare exception is John Horse, who, after surrendering during the Second Seminole War, wrote a few letters to U.S. officials protesting broken promises. But these letters were not widely published or acknowledged. For the most part, Black Seminole women and non-leaders were entirely left out of written records. Even within Native American historiography, the Black Seminoles' story often went unnoticed for many years. Seminole tribal histories passed down through their communities tended to focus on chiefs and warriors, with Black allies acknowledged but not given the same spotlight. After the removal to Oklahoma, Black Seminoles lived in separate freedmen bands within the Seminole Nation. Over time, a division formed between Seminoles of native ancestry and freedmen, which meant that the shared struggle and history of these two groups weren't always preserved in the same unified way. As a result, the oral traditions of the Black Seminoles didn't always reach beyond their own communities, so people outside those groups rarely heard these stories until scholars took the time to document them. In places like the Bahamas, the Andros Island community stayed isolated for nearly 150 years, keeping their story hidden from the wider world until anthropologists started investigating in the late 20th century. Rosalind Howard's research, for example, involved living in red bays and recording oral histories that would have otherwise been lost to time. The people of Red Bays remembered their ancestors' escape from Florida in 1821 and held on to a strong Black Seminole identity, even though there was little written documentation to back up their claims. Communities like Red Bays and Nacimiento were essentially invisible in conventional history because so little was written about them. They remained off the radar until someone actively sought them out. The reliance on oral history, however, has its limitations. Over time, details or stories can be lost due to the fragility of memory or because elders passed away before they had a chance to pass on their knowledge. This is a challenge that many indigenous and minority histories face. For the Black Seminoles, by the time scholars became interested in their story, they had to rely on the oldest living descendants, who were often several generations removed from the events in Florida. Even so, many core narratives have survived. Stories about the battles they fought, the trek to Mexico, and the lives of the scouts. This endurance of oral tradition is a testament to the strength of their cultural memory. But imagine if someone like John Horse, or any of the other Black Seminole leaders, had published an autobiography during their time. How much sooner would their story have entered the public's consciousness? The absence of such personal records delayed the widespread recognition of their contributions to history. Fortunately, in recent decades, there has been a growing movement to uncover, preserve, and honor the history of the Black Seminoles. Scholars, community leaders, and Black Seminole descendants themselves have worked tirelessly to make sure this long-suppressed story is passed on to future generations. One of the major forces behind reclaiming the Black Seminoles' history has been scholarly research and literature. Early efforts by historians like Kenneth W. Porter helped pave the way, as he collected oral histories and archival data about the Black Seminoles, culminating in works like The Black Seminoles, History of a Freedom-Seeking People. This was just the beginning. Historians and authors like Kevin Mulroy, William Loren Katz, and Daniel F. Littlefield built on this foundation, expanding the scholarship to include in-depth examinations of the Seminole freedmen in Oklahoma and the Muskogee community in Mexico. These scholars brought the incredible narrative of Black Seminole resistance and diaspora to light in a way that was meticulously documented. With this research, the Black Seminoles were no longer treated as a footnote in history. Instead, academic conferences and journal articles began to regard their story as an essential part of understanding U.S. history. This shift marked a profound change in how the Black Seminoles were viewed, not just as peripheral figures, but as central characters in the story of freedom, resistance, and cultural survival. Their long-overlooked history was being recognized, filling an important gap in the narrative of American history. By the 21st century, even popular outlets like JSTOR Daily, Zen Education Project, and educational magazines have published accessible articles summarizing Black Seminole history for wider audiences. For example, a 2020 JSTOR Daily article highlighted the community's resilient history of repeated invasions and resistance to enslavement, directly acknowledging the significance of the Black Seminoles. The fact that such material is now appearing in these widely read forums marks a clear shift toward recognition and respect for their story. Additionally, some high school curricula, particularly those influenced by initiatives like Black History Month, have started to incorporate Black Seminole history. Educators argue that including their stories is crucial for showing students that the history of Black people is not just one of submission, but of resistance and revolution. This change is a sign of progress in breaking the long silence surrounding the Black Seminoles and their role in the broader fight for freedom. Even more significant are the efforts of Black Seminole descendant communities to ensure that their heritage is not lost. In Texas, the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery Association has become a key organization in preserving this history. Every year, they organize Seminole Days in Brackettville, Texas, a reunion and celebration where hundreds of descendants from across the country gather to commemorate their ancestors. This event serves as a living reminder of the Black Seminoles' incredible legacy, keeping their memory alive for future generations and further cementing their place in history. During Seminole Days, participants come together for a range of activities that serve to both educate and celebrate the Black Seminole heritage. These include history seminars, guided tours of important sites like Seminole Canyon, where their ancestors once trekked, and memorial ceremonies at the Seminole Scout Cemetery. The events have a dual purpose: educating younger generations and the wider public about the history of the Black Seminoles, while also reinforcing a sense of identity and pride among descendants. As one organizer, Wendy Goodlow, explained, walking the same land as their ancestors and hearing the stories from elders helps the youth internalize their heritage in a way no textbook ever could. Steve Warrior, another descendant, shared that learning about the struggles of their forebears, how they struggled to get us where we are now, inspires perseverance and pride in their own lives. Community preservation also takes shape in museums and monuments. In Brackettville, Texas, the Seminole Indian Scouts Museum has been established, showcasing artifacts, photographs, and documents related to the Black Seminoles and their role as Army Scouts. The cemetery where many scouts and elders are buried is considered hallowed ground. Among those buried, there are 4 Black Seminole scouts who received the Medal of Honor, their graves standing as a testament to their valor, a recognition that went unheralded for years. Community leaders like Augusta Pines are working to improve the cemetery's facilities so it can serve as a proper memorial. In Oklahoma, the Seminole Nation's museum and cultural events have increasingly acknowledged the contributions of the freedmen bands, and abroad, in places like Nacimiento, Mexico, and Andros Island, Bahamas, local celebrations, like an annual Juneteenth in Nacimiento, are fostering cross-border connections and underscoring the global aspect of Black Seminole heritage. Legal and political advocacy is another crucial component of the ongoing reclamation of Black Seminole history. In Oklahoma, descendants have fought for tribal recognition and rights. For many years, the Seminole Nation excluded freedmen descendants from full citizenship and access to tribal resources, a policy rooted in the redefinition of tribal membership after the Civil War. These injustices led to court battles and negotiations, emphasizing the real-world consequences of the erasure of Black Seminole identity. While legal outcomes have been mixed, the very struggle has brought visibility to the Black Seminole descendants, asserting their desire to be acknowledged as part of the Seminole story. Similarly, advocates in academic and cultural institutions have worked to push for the inclusion of Black Seminole history in exhibits and programs. The National Park Service has begun recognizing sites like Fort Mose and the Angola Settlement site in Florida as part of its Network to Freedom, highlighting that the quest for freedom by enslaved people did not just lead north, but also south to Black Seminole havens. In Florida, state historical markers have started to acknowledge Black Seminole forts and cemeteries, allowing the public to learn about them in the places where they once thrived. An especially important area of preservation is language and folklore. Linguists like Ian Hancock studied Afro-Seminole Creole, sometimes called Gula Seminole Creole, the unique language that developed among Black Seminoles, and found that into the late 20th century, some elders in Oklahoma and Texas still spoke it. By documenting and recognizing this Creole as a distinct language, scholars have highlighted the rich cultural world of the Black Seminoles. This language is a living piece of evidence of their blended heritage and long separateness from mainstream societies. Efforts to preserve it, through recordings or teaching younger generations, contribute to keeping the culture alive. Folktales and songs are also being recorded. For instance, the Seminole Scouts descendants in Texas have traditional songs, some in a Creole mix of Spanish, African phrases, and English, that are performed at gatherings. These are now sometimes shared in documentaries or online videos, to reach a broader audience. Finally, modern media and art have begun to embrace the Black Seminole story in meaningful ways. Documentaries like those featured by PBS on Black Indians, independent films about figures like John Horse, and accessible books such as Kevin Mulroy's Freedom on the Border have made this history available to a broader audience. Even children's books focusing on the Black Seminoles are helping to introduce younger generations to their important legacy. In some unexpected places, recognition is also emerging. Mascogos in Mexico, for example, have been featured in Mexican media, connecting their story to broader Afro-Mexican heritage discussions. The combined efforts of scholarly research and community initiatives have made it clear that the Black Seminoles are no longer invisible. They are increasingly recognized as a key part of American history that illustrates the deep connections between Native American and African American struggles for freedom. The recovered narrative now emphasizes that American freedom wasn't only shaped by battles like those at Gettysburg or figures like Frederick Douglass. It was also fought for in the swamps of Florida, where Black Seminoles stood shoulder to shoulder with Seminole warriors, in the Bahamas by those who escaped slavery, and along the dusty trails to Mexico, where some chose exile over enslavement. There's still a lot of work to be done, though. Many people still don't know about the Black Seminoles, and there's still a lot of debate about how their history is understood. But things are starting to change. Descendant Wendy Goodlow put it beautifully when she said that the younger generation will keep hearing their stories from their grandmothers or great uncles, and that as long as there's breath in our body, we'll make sure to always gather every year. Through these ongoing efforts to remember and educate, what was once intentionally hidden is finally being brought into the light. The Black Seminoles are finally being recognized for their resilience, their contributions, and the huge impact they had in the larger story of freedom and resistance in the United States. The journey of the Black Seminoles from the shadows of hidden history to recognition serves as a powerful reminder that history is not fixed. It is contested, suppressed, and reclaimed over time. We've explored why their story was buried. Racism, slaveholder politics, and the creation of a national myth all work to silence the history of this Afro-Indigenous community that bravely resisted oppression. But we've also seen how that narrative is being brought back to life by those dedicated to telling the truth. As more people learn about the Black Seminoles story, what was once hidden is turning into an inspiring chronicle of resistance and triumph. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the incredible history of the Black Seminoles. We hope you enjoyed this remarkable story that has long been overlooked. Are there more details about them that you'd like to share? Feel free to leave a comment below to keep the conversation going. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can stay updated with our upcoming insightful videos. Until next time, keep uncovering the stories that matter and never stop learning, because every story is worth telling.